Jonathan Lancaster had it all: money, power, the perfect life. But when he fakes his own bankruptcy to test his wife's love, he's left shattered by her immediate betrayal. She walks out the next day for another wealthy man. What she never expected: Jonathan's comeback would be greater than anything she ever imagined. The city stretched out beneath Jonathan Lancaster's penthouse, a glittering sprawl of ambition and excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the view like a portrait of his success. Skyscrapers standing tall against the night sky, highways glowing with endless streams of headlights. Inside, the warmth of polished marble floors, soft leather couches, and curated art pieces gave the place an air of effortless wealth, a testament to everything Jonathan had built. The scent of aged whiskey lingered in his glass as he swirled it absent-mindedly, his fingers tapping against the rim. In the background, laughter echoed from the other room, mingling with the hum of classical music and the occasional pop of a champagne cork. It was another evening of celebration, another night where the wealthy gathered to toast themselves and their achievements. His wife, Catherine, was the center of it all. She stood near the fireplace, a vision in sapphire blue silk, her diamond earrings catching the light as she threw her head back in laughter. She was effortlessly beautiful, always poised, always saying the right thing. She had been by his side for 5 years, living in the kind of luxury most people could only dream of. And yet, something felt wrong. Jonathan took another sip of his whiskey, watching her closely. The way she smiled at their guests, the ease with which she floated from one conversation to the next. It was all so perfect. Too perfect. He had never questioned their life together before, had never stopped to wonder whether the love between them was real or simply a convenient arrangement. But lately, doubts had crept in like a slow poison. "Jonathan," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Michael Hastings, an old friend from his college days, standing beside him with a knowing smirk. Michael had always been the skeptic, the kind of man who saw through the illusions that wealth created. He clinked his glass against Jonathan's, studying him. "You look like a man lost in his own house." Jonathan let out a dry chuckle. "Is that what I look like?" Michael leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I know that face. You're questioning something." Jonathan hesitated, his gaze drifting back to Catherine. She was talking to Nathan Sterling, an older businessman, well-connected and significantly wealthier than even Jonathan himself. The way she angled her body toward him, the way her fingers lightly grazed her necklace when she laughed. It wasn't obvious, not enough to call attention. But Jonathan had spent years mastering the art of reading people. Michael followed his gaze and let out a low whistle. "Now that's interesting." Jonathan's grip on his glass tightened. "You think so?" Michael shrugged. "Depends on what you're looking for." He took a slow sip of his drink before adding, "You ever wonder if people are here for you, or for what you have?" The question struck a nerve. Jonathan exhaled sharply, forcing a smirk. "That's a dangerous train of thought." "It is," Michael agreed, "but it's also an important one." Jonathan didn't respond. Instead, he watched as Catherine smiled at Nathan, her fingers delicately adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jonathan had seen that gesture before, when she wanted to appear effortlessly graceful, alluring. Michael set his glass down and leaned against the bar. "You ever thought about testing it?" Jonathan turned to him. "Testing what?" Michael shrugged. "If you lost it all, the money, the power, who do you think would still be standing by your side?" Jonathan forced a chuckle. "Are you suggesting I throw away everything just to see who's loyal?" Michael tilted his head. "Not throw it away. Just see the truth." The words sank into Jonathan's mind, sticking to the parts of him that had already been questioning everything. He had spent his entire life building his empire, making sure he would never have to experience struggle again. But in the process, had he surrounded himself with people who only loved what he could provide? He thought about the past 5 years. Catherine had never truly experienced hardship. She had stepped into his world with ease, never once questioning where the money came from or what would happen if it ever disappeared. She adored the life they had built, the vacations in the south of France, the penthouse parties, the couture dresses waiting for her in a walk-in closet bigger than most apartments. But if that life were taken away, What would be left? That night, after the guests had gone and the penthouse was quiet, Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed, his tie loosened, his mind racing. Catherine emerged from the bathroom, her hair tied back, her makeup wiped away, yet still looking effortlessly stunning. She slipped under the covers, stretching out like a queen in her palace. "You've been quiet tonight," she murmured, studying him. Jonathan hesitated before answering. "Just thinking." She smirked. Dangerous habit. He turned to face her fully. "Catherine, if we lost everything, our money, the house, the lifestyle, what would you do?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "Why would we lose everything?" "It's just hypothetical." She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Jonathan, that's ridiculous. You're not the kind of man who loses. But if I did?" She frowned slightly, propping herself up on one elbow. "Is something going on?" "No," he said quickly. "Just humor me." Catherine let out a sigh, clearly not taking the question seriously. "I don't know. I mean, I love you, but let's be realistic. That's never going to happen." She was already closing her eyes, ready to dismiss the conversation. She hadn't answered him. Jonathan lay back, staring at the ceiling, his mind whirring. The decision was made. He needed to know, and the only way to be sure was to take everything away and see who was left. "Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Jonathan's place, would you have done this test to find out who's really by your side? Drop a comment below and let me know what you would do. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. The headlines broke first thing in the morning, spreading through the business world like wildfire. Jonathan Lancaster, once one of the most powerful self-made millionaires in the city, was finished. The words bankruptcy, financial ruin, and investor panic were stamped across every news outlet, plastered on digital billboards, and whispered behind closed doors. The empire he had built with precision and strategy had seemingly collapsed overnight. The moment Jonathan opened his eyes that morning, he knew the real test was about to begin. His wife, Catherine, was still asleep beside him. Her blonde hair spread across the pillow in soft waves, her breath steady, unbothered. For a fleeting second, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, she would wake up, turn to him, and ask what they would do next. Maybe she would hold him, reassure him, tell him they'd figure it out together. But deep down, he knew better. The moment the first notification buzzed on her phone, Catherine stirred. With a groggy sigh, she reached for the device, her brows furrowing as her eyes adjusted to the screen's glow. Then, suddenly, she sat up straighter. Jonathan watched her in silence, his own phone untouched on the nightstand. His own name splashed across the news in ways that made him sick. "What the hell is this?" Catherine's voice was sharp, her fingers tapping rapidly against the screen. She skimmed the articles, her breath quickening. "Jonathan, what is this?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's exactly what it looks like." Her head snapped toward him, her green eyes wide. "No, this can't be real. I wish it wasn't." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she shoved the covers aside, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed and standing up. She paced, her silk robe fluttering behind her, her fingers gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "This doesn't just happen. You don't just lose everything. Bad investments. The market turned. Too much risk, not enough liquidity." He listed off evenly, as if it wasn't all a lie, as if he hadn't orchestrated this entire collapse just to see what she would do. "It caught up with me." Catherine let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "You mean to tell me that you, the Jonathan Lancaster, let this happen? The man who has always been 5 steps ahead? The man who never makes a deal without an escape plan? Are you seriously telling me you didn't see this coming?" Jonathan let the silence stretch. He watched as the truth unfolded in her mind, watched as the reality of the situation seeped in like an ink stain on silk. She wanted to believe there was a solution, that he had some secret trick up his sleeve. But with every second that passed, her expression shifted from disbelief to something else, something colder. She turned toward him slowly. "So what now?" He studied her carefully. "We downsize. We cut back. We'll need to leave the penthouse. I have some emergency funds, but they won't last long. We need to adjust." Catherine blinked. "Adjust?"
"Yes."
Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time in years, Jonathan saw something raw flicker across her face. It wasn't grief. It wasn't worry. It was calculation. She pressed her fingertips against her temples, inhaling deeply before speaking again. "What does this mean for me?" Jonathan let the words sink in, let them settle deep in his chest like lead. "What do you mean?" She scoffed, dropping her hands to her sides. "Jonathan, you know exactly what I mean. What happens to me? What happens to my life? Do you expect me to just, what? Move into some tiny apartment and live like a nobody?" He clenched his jaw, his pulse pounding. "You're my wife, Catherine." She flinched. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker of something across her face, but he caught it. He caught it and held on to it. "You're asking me to give up everything." Her voice had softened, but there was no tenderness behind it, only quiet accusation. "Everything I've built with you. Everything I've gotten used to. I don't know if I can." She cut herself off, shaking her head. Jonathan's stomach twisted, but he kept his expression neutral. "So you're saying it's conditional?" Catherine's jaw tightened.
"That's not fair."
"Isn't it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, rubbing her arms as if she were suddenly cold. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, she spoke. "I need time to think." Jonathan let out a slow, steady breath. "Take all the time you need." She nodded once, then grabbed her phone and left the room. He listened to her footsteps fade down the hallway, listened as she called someone. Someone she clearly didn't want him to hear. And then, an hour later, he heard the sound of a suitcase zipper. By the time he stepped into the living room, she was already near the door. A single Louis Vuitton bag beside her, her coat draped over her arm. She looked at him with an unreadable expression, something close to regret, but not quite. "I'll call you," she said. Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. "Safe travels." She hesitated, just for a second. Then, without another word, she picked up her bag, pulled open the door, and walked out of his life. A thick, suffocating silence filled the penthouse the moment Catherine walked out. Jonathan stood motionless in the grand entryway, staring at the door as if expecting it to swing open again, as if she might change her mind. But the only sound that followed was the low hum of the city beyond the glass walls, the distant wail of sirens, and the mechanical ticking of the antique clock on the wall. The penthouse suddenly felt enormous, cavernous in its emptiness. Every polished surface, every perfectly curated piece of furniture, felt sterile, devoid of life. His glass of whiskey sat untouched on the bar, the ice melting into nothing. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples before walking toward the living room, his footsteps echoing through the space that had once been filled with laughter, music, and the soft murmurs of conversations that no longer mattered. She had left. Not in a dramatic storm of tears and accusations, not with a promise to stand by his side no matter what. No, Catherine had been disturbingly calm, her decision swift and clinical. She had asked her questions, calculated her risks, and within an hour, she had packed her essentials and walked away. It wasn't the loss of her presence that unsettled him. It was the ease with which she had severed the ties. No hesitation, no looking back. He had expected disappointment, maybe even betrayal, but he hadn't expected how cold the reality would feel when it finally arrived. Jonathan loosened the collar of his shirt, pulling it apart as if it had suddenly become too tight. The weight pressing against his chest wasn't sadness. It was clarity. He had spent years convincing himself that Catherine loved him, that they were a team, that their relationship was built on more than wealth and status. But now the truth sat in front of him, stark and undeniable. He had given her everything: luxury, security, a life most people could only dream of. And at the first sign of instability, she had vanished without a second thought. He moved toward the bar, pouring himself another drink, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his head. He took a slow sip, letting the burn of the whiskey settle deep in his chest before setting the glass down with a quiet thud. His gaze drifted to his phone on the coffee table, screen glowing with unread messages. He knew what they would say. The vultures were already circling. The first few texts were from acquaintances, their tone laced with artificial concern. "I heard the news. Let me know if you need anything." Empty words. Then there were the opportunists, the ones who saw his downfall as an opening. "Maybe we should talk. I have some ideas." No doubt offers to buy out his remaining assets at a fraction of their worth. And then there was one message that stood out from the rest. "Catherine, I'll be staying with Nathan for now. I need time to process this. We'll talk soon." Jonathan let out a slow breath, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. Nathan Sterling. The name settled in his mind like an iron weight. It wasn't a surprise, not really. He had noticed the way Sterling had hovered around Catherine at every event, the lingering glances, the casual touches disguised as harmless gestures. Catherine had played the game well, never too obvious, never too distant. She had positioned herself perfectly, ensuring she had a soft place to land before she even took the fall. He tossed the phone aside, dragging a hand through his hair before pacing toward the windows. The city stretched beneath him, oblivious to the collapse of one of its wealthiest men. Life carried on. The people below still fought for cabs, still hurried to their jobs, still lived in a world where money dictated everything. His own world, the one he had built so carefully, was unraveling, but to them, he was just another headline. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His pulse quickened, irrational hope flickering for a second before he pushed it aside. It wasn't Catherine. She wasn't coming back. He crossed the room, pulling the door open, and found Michael Hastings standing on the other side, his expression unreadable. Jonathan had known Michael for over a decade, one of the few people he still considered a real friend. And yet, even now, he wasn't sure if that loyalty would last. Michael stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, glancing around the penthouse before letting out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "I half expected to find you passed out in a whiskey coma." Jonathan shut the door, leaning against it with his arms crossed.
Not yet.
Michael studied him for a moment before moving toward the bar, pouring himself a drink as if he owned the place. "So," he said, swirling the liquid in his glass, "she's gone?" Jonathan exhaled, nodding. "An hour ago." Michael took a sip, setting the glass down with a quiet clink. "And where'd she run off to?" Jonathan let out a humorless laugh. "The Sterling estate." Michael winced.
That was fast.
Jonathan smirked, though there was no humor behind it. Almost like she had it planned. Michael ran a hand down his face, shaking his head. "So that's it? She didn't even pretend to fight for this?"
Nope.
Michael exhaled sharply. "Damn." He leaned back against the bar, his gaze heavy. "Well, if nothing else, you got your answer." Jonathan nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against his arm. "Yeah, I did." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, oblivious to the fact that everything Jonathan had once believed in had just been dismantled in the span of a few hours. He had spent years building a life of wealth, status, and power, surrounding himself with people who praised him, admired him, envied him. And now, one by one, they were all disappearing. Michael studied him carefully before speaking. "So, what's next? You going to let the world think you're actually broke? Or do you have another play?" Jonathan exhaled, stepping away from the door, his movements slow but deliberate. "I need to see how deep this goes. I need to know who else walks away. Friends, business partners. I need to know if there's anyone left who isn't just here for the money." Michael arched an eyebrow. "You sure you want to do that?" Jonathan met his gaze, his jaw tightening. Better to know now than waste another 10 years on people who were never real. Michael let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "You're playing with fire." "Maybe," Jonathan said, picking up his glass and taking another sip. "But at least I won't be the one getting burned." Michael studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "All right then, let's see who's still standing when the dust settles." Jonathan stared out at the city, his grip tightening around the glass. Somewhere across town, Catherine was probably sipping expensive wine, draped in luxury, already rewriting their history in her mind. But she had made her choice, and now he would make his. The test wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Jonathan sat in the back of the black sedan, staring out at the city as it blurred past him. It had been 2 weeks since the news of his downfall had spread, 2 weeks since Catherine had walked out without a backward glance. In that time, the world had wasted no time erasing him. His name, once spoken with admiration and envy, was now met with whispers of disbelief, with murmurs of pity, with the unmistakable stench of mockery. He had spent years building his empire, yet it had taken less than a month for it to crumble, at least in the eyes of everyone watching. His driver? No, not his driver, not anymore. Pulled up to the curb outside a nondescript apartment building on the lower side of the city, far removed from the glass towers and high-end restaurants he once frequented. The building was old, its brick facade weathered by time, the paint peeling around the windows. It wasn't a slum, but it was a far cry from the penthouse he had called home for years. He exhaled, gripping the handle of the door for a moment before stepping out, his leather shoes hitting the cracked pavement. The weight of his decision pressed down on him. This was part of the plan. He needed to disappear from the life he had known, to strip himself of the safety net that had always been there, to see who, if anyone, remained. The apartment was small, modestly furnished, and devoid of anything unnecessary. The living room had a worn-out couch, a coffee table with scratches etched into the wood, and a small kitchen tucked away in the corner. A single window overlooked the street below, where people bustled about their daily lives, oblivious to the man standing behind the glass. He had chosen this place deliberately. No security, no doorman, no walls of privilege separating him from the real world. If he was going to test those around him, he had to make the fall look real. He tossed his keys onto the counter and rolled up his sleeves, letting out a slow breath. The silence was deafening. He had never truly been alone before. Not like this. His life had always been filled with movement, with noise, with people hovering around him, whether for business or pleasure. Now, there was nothing. No Catherine, no staff, no constant buzz of his phone demanding his attention. A sharp knock at the door broke the quiet. His muscles tensed for a second before he exhaled and walked over, pulling it open. Michael stood there, hands in the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. "Nice place," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Really went all out, huh?" Jonathan smirked, shutting the door behind him. "Thought I'd embrace the full experience." Michael let out a low whistle as he glanced around. "Man, I knew you were committed, but this is something else." He turned to face him. "Any second thoughts?" Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "No, I need to see this through." Michael studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, then let's see who sticks around." The next few days were an exercise in patience. The calls had already stopped coming. The messages had dwindled to nothing. The invitations, once constant, had disappeared entirely. Jonathan walked the streets like a ghost, watching the world he had once ruled move on without him. He went to restaurants where he had once been greeted like royalty, only to find his usual tables occupied, the hosts barely glancing at him. The people who had once clamored to shake his hand now avoided his gaze. The city had already forgotten him, but there were still a few who hadn't. A week into his self-imposed exile, he found himself standing outside a small cafe on the quieter side of town, a place he hadn't set foot in for years. It was owned by Margot Whitman, a woman who had once worked as one of his company's accountants before leaving to start her own business. He had always respected her. She had never been one to flatter him, never been the type to fawn over wealth. He wasn't sure why he was here, but something had pulled him toward this place. He pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. The aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile boardrooms he had spent most of his life in. Margot stood behind the counter, her auburn hair pulled into a loose bun, her sleeves rolled up as she worked. She glanced up, and for a second, he saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes before she wiped her hands on a towel and walked over. "Well, look who it is," she said, crossing her arms. "Thought you had better places to be." Jonathan smirked, though there was no real amusement behind it. "Turns out I don't." Margot studied him for a long moment before tilting her head toward an empty seat. Sit. You look like you could use a coffee. He hesitated for only a second before sliding into the chair. A few minutes later, she set a cup in front of him, leaning against the counter. So, she said, "You're really broke, huh?" Jonathan picked up the cup, taking a slow sip before meeting her gaze.
That's what they say.
Margot raised an eyebrow. And what do you say? He let out a breath, setting the cup down. I say people show you who they really are when they think you have nothing left to offer. Margot nodded slowly, wiping down the counter. And what have you learned so far? Jonathan smirked, though it was laced with something bitter. That I had far fewer friends than I thought. She let out a short laugh. You're just figuring that out now? He chuckled, shaking his head. I guess I always knew. I just never wanted to admit it. Margot leaned on the counter, watching him. So what now? You going to disappear into some hole and brood for the rest of your life? Jonathan exhaled, staring at the coffee in front of him. No, I'm going to figure out what's next. Without the noise. Without the people who were never real to begin with. Margot studied him for another long moment before nodding. Good. Just make sure you don't get so caught up in testing everyone else that you forget who you really are. Jonathan looked up at her, something shifting inside him. He hadn't expected kindness. He hadn't expected anything, really. But in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in his life had been there for the money. Maybe there were still a few who saw him for something more. And maybe that was enough. The days blurred into each other. Jonathan had traded the sound of crystal glasses clinking at exclusive rooftop parties for the quiet hum of traffic outside his modest apartment. He had always thought silence was something he'd enjoy, that solitude would give him clarity, but he was beginning to realize it was a different kind of weight, one that settled deep in his chest and refused to leave. The emptiness of the space mirrored the emptiness in his life. Catherine had walked away without hesitation. The people who once orbited around him had vanished, and the invitations had stopped coming. It was almost amusing how quickly a man could go from sought after to invisible. Margot's cafe had become a strange sort of refuge. He found himself stopping by more often than he cared to admit, sipping coffee at the corner table, watching life unfold around him. The cafe had a warmth to it, a sense of authenticity that he had long forgotten existed. People weren't here to impress each other or flaunt their wealth. They were just here, living. It felt foreign. Margot didn't treat him any differently than she had before the world believed he was bankrupt. If anything, she seemed amused by his presence, watching as he adjusted to his new reality. She had never been one for pity, never been the type to stroke egos, and maybe that was why Jonathan found himself coming back. One evening, as the cafe was winding down, Margot pulled up a chair across from him, setting down 2 steaming mugs. "All right, Lancaster," she said, crossing her arms. "You've been sulking in my cafe for days. It's getting pathetic." Jonathan smirked, taking the mug. "Maybe I like the coffee." She arched an eyebrow. "You like the anonymity." He exhaled, swirling the liquid in his cup. "Maybe." Margot leaned back, watching him. "So, what's the grand plan? You gonna sit in this coffee shop forever, waiting for some epiphany to hit you?" Jonathan let out a dry chuckle. "You sound like Michael." "Michael's a smart guy," she said, tilting her head. "But let's be real. You didn't get where you were by waiting for things to happen. You made them happen." He tapped his fingers against the side of the mug. "Yeah, and look how that turned out." Margot rolled her eyes. "Oh, cut the self-pity. You're not some tragic hero in a Shakespeare play. You got played. It happens. What matters is what you do next." Jonathan smirked, shaking his head. "You always this blunt?" "Only with people who need to hear it." She took a sip of her coffee before setting it down. "Tell me something. Do you actually want to disappear? Or do you just not know where to start?" The question sat between them, heavy and unspoken. Jonathan stared at his reflection in the dark liquid, letting her words settle. Did he want to disappear? No. But did he know where to go from here? That was an entirely different question. Margot sighed, stretching her arms above her head. "Look, you want a distraction? Help out around here." Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" You're always here anyway, she said, gesturing around. Might as well make yourself useful. You want me to work here? She shrugged. Why not? You're not doing anything else. Jonathan let out a laugh, shaking his head. Margot, I ran $1 billion company, and now you don't, she said without missing a beat. So you can either sit around feeling sorry for yourself, or you can get your hands dirty and remember what it's like to build something from the ground up. Jonathan stared at her, trying to gauge if she was serious. Her expression didn't waver. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You know, I can't decide if you're trying to help or if you just enjoy watching me suffer. Margot smirked. A little bit of both. And just like that, Jonathan found himself standing behind the counter of a small cafe, sleeves rolled up, learning how to make espresso. It was ridiculous. It was surreal. And yet, as he stood there, his hands gripping the portafilter, something strange happened. He didn't feel like he was drowning anymore. The first few days were an adjustment. He fumbled with the machine, burned himself more times than he cared to admit, and had to endure Margot's unimpressed stares every time he messed up an order. But there was something almost therapeutic about the simplicity of it all. No board meetings, no endless emails, no carefully crafted press releases, just coffee, people, and conversations that didn't revolve around profit margins. And then, something even more unexpected happened. One afternoon, while cleaning up behind the counter, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Well, this is a sight I never thought I'd see. Jonathan turned, his stomach tightening at the sight of Nathan Sterling standing near the entrance, his smirk as infuriating as ever. The man was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit exuding the kind of effortless confidence that came with knowing you were at the top. Jonathan straightened, wiping his hands on a towel. Sterling. Nathan let his gaze sweep over the cafe, then landed back on Jonathan, his smirk widening. I have to say, I admire the dedication to the role. Really committing to the fallen man aesthetic. Jonathan clenched his jaw, but his expression remained neutral. What do you want? Nathan stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough to ensure the conversation stayed between them. I wanted to see it for myself. You, actually working for a living. It's quite the transformation. Jonathan chuckled, crossing his arms. And yet, you went out of your way to come here. Almost like you needed to see it to believe it. Nathan's smirk faltered just slightly. Catherine mentioned you'd gone off the grid. Said you were figuring things out. Jonathan exhaled through his nose. She would know all about moving on quickly. Nathan shrugged. You can't fault her for being practical. She saw an opportunity and took it. The words were meant to sting, but Jonathan didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. And what about you, Nathan? What's your excuse? You always had the money. So what's the appeal? Winning? Taking something just because you can? Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, Jonathan, you always did think everything was about strategy. But let me give you some advice. Sometimes, the people who fall aren't worth saving. Jonathan met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Funny, I was just thinking the same thing. Nathan studied him for a moment before stepping back. Well, this was fun. I'll let you get back to your newfound purpose. Jonathan watched as he walked away, the bell above the door jingling softly as he left. Margot appeared at his side, arms crossed. Well, that was something. Jonathan exhaled, shaking his head. That guy is the human equivalent of a cockroach. Margot smirked. And yet, you didn't let him get to you. Jonathan stared at the door for a long moment before turning back to the counter. No, he murmured. I didn't. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like that meant something. Catherine awoke to the soft rustling of silk sheets, the morning sun filtering through the towering windows of Nathan Sterling's estate. The bedroom, adorned with expensive artwork and custom Italian furniture, smelled of luxury, the kind of wealth that never worried about the passage of time, about uncertainty, about loss. For a moment, she lay still, eyes tracing the intricate gold detailing on the ceiling, her mind struggling to silence the nagging thoughts creeping into the edges of her carefully crafted new life. It had been 3 weeks since she had left Jonathan, 3 weeks since she had packed a single bag, walked out of their penthouse, and stepped into the world of a man whose net worth overshadowed even Jonathan's at his peak. Nathan had been more than willing to welcome her into his life, draping her in new gifts, promising her that she would never have to worry about another financial disaster again. And yet, despite the diamond bracelet on her wrist and the silk nightgown that had cost more than some people's rent, there was a strange hollowness in the air, an unsettling emptiness she couldn't quite name. She rolled onto her side, expecting to find Nathan beside her, but the bed was empty. A small frown pulled at her lips. He had always been an early riser, but she had assumed he would at least wake her before starting his day. Pushing the covers back, she slid out of bed, her bare feet sinking into the thick Persian rug. The estate was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made her skin prickle. She wrapped herself in a silk robe and padded toward the hallway, listening for any signs of life. Descending the grand staircase, she spotted one of the housekeepers arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. "Where's Nathan?" Catherine asked, keeping her tone light. The woman glanced up, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Sterling left early this morning. He had meetings." Catherine nodded slowly, pressing her lips together. "Did he say when he'd be back?" "No, ma'am." The answer sat uneasily in her stomach. She turned away, wandering into the expansive living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sprawling gardens. She had thought she would feel powerful here, that stepping into this new chapter would bring a sense of triumph, a confirmation that she had made the right choice. Instead, the space felt cold, detached. The house was beautiful, but it wasn't hers. The staff was attentive, but they weren't warm. And Nathan was generous, but he was not Jonathan. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome. She scowled, shaking it off. This was what she had wanted. This was the life she had chosen. She spent the morning idly flipping through magazines, scrolling through social media, waiting for something, anything, to pull her from the strange restlessness gnawing at her. By noon, frustration had settled in. She picked up her phone and dialed Nathan's number. It rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. Her jaw tightened as she ended the call, staring at the screen. She had never had to chase Jonathan. He had always been available, always made time for her, always put her first. Nathan, however, seemed to operate on a different set of rules. Hours passed before he finally returned. She was waiting for him in the sitting room, legs crossed, a glass of wine in her hand. He walked in, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression unreadable as he set his briefcase down. "You didn't answer my call," she said, keeping her voice even. Nathan barely glanced at her as he loosened his tie. "I was in meetings." Catherine let out a quiet scoff, swirling the wine in her glass. "You could have texted." He arched a brow, finally looking at her. "Catherine, I have an empire to run. I don't have time to check in every few hours." A flicker of annoyance flashed through her, but she forced a smile. "I just wasn't sure if something was wrong." Nathan smirked, stepping closer. "Nothing is wrong, but I'm not Jonathan. I don't coddle." The words hit harder than she expected. She swallowed, tilting her head. "Is that what you think he did?" Nathan let out a low chuckle. "I think Jonathan spent too much time making sure you were comfortable." He ran a finger along the edge of her wine glass. "I don't do that. You're here because I want you here, but I don't owe you explanations." Catherine's stomach twisted. This was different. With Jonathan, she had been the center of his world. Here, she was just another piece of a much larger puzzle, a part of Nathan's curated life, but not its focus. She put down her glass, standing. "I see." Nathan studied her for a moment before brushing past her, heading toward the bar to pour himself a drink. "Relax, Catherine. Enjoy what you have. You're in a better position than most." Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned and left the room, her thoughts racing. Over the next few days, she began to notice things she had been too blinded by excitement to see before. Nathan was attentive when he wanted to be, but there was a transactional air to their interactions, a sense that she was merely another acquisition in his long list of successes. He never asked about her thoughts, her feelings. There were no long conversations, no stolen moments of laughter. She had left a man who had adored her for a man who barely noticed when she walked into the room. And then there was the other problem. The women. She had heard whispers at the last gala they attended. The knowing glances from other women. The way a few of them smirked when she introduced herself as Nathan's partner. She hadn't paid it much mind then, too focused on solidifying her place in this new world. But now she couldn't ignore it. The final blow came when she stumbled upon a message on his phone, carelessly left open on the marble countertop. It was from someone named Elise. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again." Catherine stared at the screen, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had traded her marriage for this? For a man who had never intended to be faithful? For a life where she was nothing more than a temporary fixture? She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I made a mistake, but it was too late to go back. Too late to undo what had been done." Jonathan had moved on, and now she was truly alone. Jonathan wiped down the last of the countertops as the cafe emptied for the night, the scent of coffee still lingering in the air. The bell above the door jingled one final time before silence settled in, wrapping the space in a stillness he was beginning to recognize as familiar. The world he had known before, the high-rises, the offices filled with men in tailored suits, the power plays behind closed doors, all of it felt like a distant echo. He had stepped away, vanished into a life where no one called his name for business deals, where no one pretended to admire him only to exploit his resources. It was quieter here, simpler. And yet, even as he moved through the routine of closing up, he could feel something in his chest, something restless, something unfinished. Margot locked the register with a sharp click, throwing a glance in his direction. She had always been perceptive, always able to see through the facade that Jonathan barely tried to maintain these days. "You've got that look again," she mused, tying her apron behind her back. Jonathan smirked faintly, running a cloth over the espresso machine. "What look?" Margot leaned against the counter, tilting her head, like a man who's pretending to be content but is just waiting for something to pull him back in. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "You always this dramatic?" She shrugged. "Only when I'm right." He exhaled, rubbing his jaw as he considered her words. She wasn't wrong. He had told himself that stepping away was necessary, that he needed to strip everything down to its bare bones to see what remained. And he had. He had learned who was real, who had stayed, who had disappeared the moment his money was no longer an asset to them. But now, with every passing day, the quiet was starting to feel less like peace and more like stagnation. Before he could say anything, his phone vibrated on the counter. He glanced down at the screen, the unknown number sending a small flicker of something sharp through his chest. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Jonathan Lancaster," came a voice he hadn't expected to hear again. Jonathan stiffened. Alan Fisk, a name he hadn't heard in months, not since his so-called fall from grace. Alan had been one of the investors who had eagerly attached himself to Jonathan's rising empire, only to jump ship the moment things turned. Now, hearing his voice again sent a slow, simmering irritation through him. Jonathan's tone was steady. "Alan." A low chuckle. "Didn't think I'd find you so easily." Jonathan leaned against the counter, watching Margot out of the corner of his eye as she pretended not to listen. "You always did have a way of sniffing out opportunity." Alan laughed. "I could say the same about you." A pause. "Look, I know things haven't exactly gone your way lately, but the way I see it, you're not the type to stay down for long." Jonathan smirked, though there was no amusement behind it. "That's interesting. You didn't seem to have this much faith in me when things turned south." Alan let out a slow breath. "Come on, Jonathan. You know how this works. When investors get nervous, they pull out. It's never personal." Jonathan clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the phone. "It was personal to me." A beat of silence. Then Alan continued, his voice smooth, calculated. "I get that. But let's be real. Talent like yours doesn't just disappear. The industry's shifting. Some of your old competitors are starting to crack. There's an opening. A chance to get back in before anyone else sees it." Jonathan exhaled slowly, pressing his thumb against the counter. He had shut that part of himself off, convinced himself that he was done, that he didn't need to return to the world that had turned on him so easily. But hearing Alan talk about the market, about gaps forming, about the kind of opportunity that only came once in a lifetime, it sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Alan's voice lowered slightly. "You built something once, Jonathan. You can do it again. But this time, smarter." Without the dead weight, Jonathan let his eyes flicker toward Margot, who was watching him now, her arms crossed. She had always been able to read between the lines. He could feel the question in her gaze. "You still there?" Alan pressed. Jonathan exhaled. "I'm here." Alan chuckled. "Good. Because I think you already know what you need to do next." Jonathan didn't answer immediately. His mind was already working through the angles, the possibilities. He had spent weeks stepping away, but the truth was, he wasn't built for stillness. He had built his empire once. He could do it again. Only this time, it would be different. When he ended the call, setting his phone down, Margot arched an eyebrow. That sounded like trouble. Jonathan let out a slow breath. More like an opportunity. Margot studied him for a long moment before nodding. "So, you going back?" Jonathan smirked, though this time, there was something sharper behind it. "Not back. Forward." Margot tilted her head, watching him. "Good." Jonathan turned to look out the window, the city stretching before him in the darkness. He had lost everything once, but now, it was time to build something new. And this time, it would be on his own terms. The city stretched before him, glittering in the early evening light, a reminder of everything he had built, lost, and was now ready to reclaim. Jonathan sat in the back of a cab, his fingers drumming against his knee as the driver navigated the familiar streets. He had avoided this part of town for months, choosing anonymity over recognition, choosing to disappear rather than face the world that had turned its back on him. But tonight, he wasn't hiding. He had spent weeks in the shadows, watching, learning, rebuilding in silence. Now, it was time to step back into the world he had once ruled. The car pulled up to the entrance of an exclusive rooftop lounge, one he had frequented back when his name carried weight in every room he entered. He hadn't been here since his supposed downfall, and as he stepped out of the car, he could feel the shift in the air. Eyes turned toward him, some in surprise, others in speculation. The whispers started immediately. Jonathan Lancaster was back. He adjusted his cuffs, exuding the effortless confidence that had once been second nature to him. He wasn't the same man who had walked away from this world. He was sharper now, wiser. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. Inside, the lounge was packed with the usual crowd. Investors, socialites, people who thrived on power and perception. He recognized most of them, and judging by the way their conversations faltered when they noticed him, they recognized him too. And then, across the room, he saw her. Catherine. She was draped in a sleek black dress, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders, holding a glass of champagne with the same effortless elegance she always had. She looked like she belonged here, like nothing had changed. But Jonathan knew better. He had seen the cracks forming in her perfect world. He had heard whispers about her growing discontent, about the way Nathan Sterling had started to lose interest, about the silent, creeping realization that she had made a mistake. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, he saw something flicker in hers. Shock, uncertainty, something almost resembling regret. Then she lifted her chin, composing herself, slipping into the carefully curated version of herself that she had perfected over the years. Jonathan didn't look away. Instead, he made his way across the room, taking his time, watching as Catherine straightened her posture, preparing for whatever this was going to be. "Jonathan." Her voice was smooth, controlled, but there was tension beneath the surface. He let a small smirk tug at the corner of his lips. "Catherine." She studied him, taking in the tailored suit, the air of quiet authority he still carried. He could see the questions forming in her mind. How was he here? How had he managed to return? "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, taking a slow sip of her drink, as if the sight of him didn't affect her. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Didn't you?" Catherine exhaled, setting her glass down. "I heard you had stepped away." "Something like that," he replied. "But you know me." I don't stay down for long. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Well, it's good to see you. I suppose you've been busy. He let out a low chuckle. You could say that. Catherine shifted, glancing around as if gauging how many people were watching this encounter. She had always been careful about perception. So, what brings you back? Business? Jonathan studied her, his gaze unwavering. Let's just say, I've been given an opportunity to correct a few mistakes. Her grip on her clutch tightened slightly. I see. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things left unsaid. Then, after a moment, Catherine spoke again, her voice softer, more careful. You look well. Jonathan smirked. Disappointed? She let out a small, breathy laugh, shaking her head. No, just surprised. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough. You shouldn't be. You, more than anyone, should know. I don't lose. Catherine swallowed, and for the first time since he had walked in, she looked truly unsettled. She had expected him to disappear, to be a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to those who lost their wealth and power. But he wasn't broken. He wasn't defeated. And that realization seemed to shake something in her. Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Jonathan Lancaster, Nathan Sterling drawled, stepping beside Catherine with an amused smirk. Back from the dead, I see. Jonathan turned, meeting Nathan's gaze with an unreadable expression. Nathan. Nathan tilted his head slightly, his confidence unwavering. I have to say, I'm impressed. Not many people bounce back from the kind of loss you took. Jonathan smirked. You'd be surprised what people are capable of when they're underestimated. Nathan chuckled, sipping his drink. So, what's the plan? Looking to reclaim your old throne? Jonathan exhaled, his gaze steady. I don't need the old throne, Nathan. I'm building a new one. Nathan's smirk faltered slightly, and Jonathan saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had expected Jonathan to be broken, to be desperate, but he wasn't. And that was a problem. Catherine remained silent, her gaze flickering between the two men. Jonathan could feel the weight of her realization sinking in. She had left him for stability, for power, for security. And now, the man she had left behind was standing in front of her, more dangerous than before. Jonathan took a step back, adjusting his cufflinks. It was good seeing you both. I'm sure we'll be crossing paths again soon. Nathan forced a chuckle. I'm sure we will. Catherine didn't say anything. She simply watched as Jonathan turned and walked away, leaving her standing beside the man she had chosen. But for the first time, Jonathan knew. She was questioning if she had chosen wrong. Jonathan stepped away from the rooftop lounge, making his way toward the quiet balcony that overlooked the city skyline. The crisp evening air carried the distant hum of traffic below, the murmurs of conversation from inside fading as he put distance between himself and the crowd. He exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the cool metal railing, staring down at the streets that had once felt like his kingdom. The city had moved on without him, just as he had expected. The whispers, the looks of surprise when he walked in tonight, none of it mattered. He hadn't come back to reclaim approval from the people who had turned their backs on him. He had come back because it was time. Time to stop pretending that he didn't belong in this world. Time to prove, to himself more than anyone else, that he had never needed their validation in the first place. The sound of heels clicking against the stone floor behind him made his shoulders stiffen slightly. He didn't turn right away. He already knew who it was. I wasn't sure you'd actually show up tonight. Catherine's voice was smooth, carefully measured, but there was something just beneath the surface, hesitation, uncertainty. Jonathan smirked to himself before finally glancing over his shoulder. Neither were they. She stepped closer, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders, her black dress hugging her frame in the same effortless elegance she had always carried. She looked every bit the woman he had once believed he knew. But now, standing in front of her again after everything that had happened, after the choices she had made, after the way she had left, he saw her differently. I have to admit, she continued, resting her fingers lightly on the railing, I didn't expect you to bounce back so quickly. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. That's because you never really understood me. Catherine inhaled slowly, her gaze flickering toward the city.
That's not fair.
Isn't it? He countered, his voice steady. You thought I was done, Catherine.
That's why you left.
She turned her head to look at him then, searching his face for something, maybe a weakness, maybe a remnant of the man she had walked away from. You put me in an impossible position, she said quietly. Jonathan arched a brow. No, I put you in a position where you had to choose. He let the words hang between them for a moment before continuing. And you made your choice. Her jaw tightened slightly. You lied to me. I gave you the chance to prove me wrong, he corrected. And you didn't. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. For a long time, Jonathan had wondered how this moment would go. If he would feel anger, resentment, regret. But now, standing here with her, he felt none of it. Only certainty. Catherine swallowed, her fingers tightening against the railing. I was scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan studied her carefully. No, you were practical. You thought staying meant struggling, and you weren't willing to take that risk. She closed her eyes for a brief second, exhaling. I thought you were finished. Jonathan nodded slowly. I know. Her gaze flickered to the entrance of the lounge, where Nathan Sterling stood, engaged in conversation with a group of men, his posture relaxed, his confidence unshaken. Catherine followed Jonathan's line of sight, her lips pressing together slightly. I thought he would be different, she said, almost to herself. Jonathan smirked. He is. Just not in the way you wanted. Catherine let out a quiet laugh, but it lacked any real amusement. She turned back to face him. You really think I never loved you? Jonathan tilted his head slightly. I think you loved the idea of us. She blinked, looking away. I don't hate you for it, he continued. I even understand it. You wanted security. You wanted certainty. And for a while, I gave you that. But love isn't about convenience, Catherine. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You didn't love me. You loved the version of me that made your life easy. She swallowed hard, her shoulders tensing. That's not true. Jonathan gave her a long, knowing look. Then tell me, if I had been nothing but an ordinary man, working a 9-to-5 job, barely making ends meet, would you have chosen me? Catherine opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. That's what I thought, Jonathan murmured. She exhaled shakily, looking away again. I didn't think you'd ever come back. Jonathan smirked. You didn't think I'd survive without you. Her lips parted slightly, as if the realization was just now settling in. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the city again. And that was your biggest mistake. Catherine let out a slow breath, nodding once as if finally accepting what had always been true. Jonathan straightened, adjusting his cufflinks before turning toward her fully. I don't regret anything, Catherine. Not what we had, not how it ended. Because in the end, it taught me exactly what I needed to know. She hesitated. And what was that? He smiled, but there was no bitterness in it. Only certainty that I was looking for love in the wrong place. Catherine's expression faltered, just for a second. She swallowed, regaining her composure. So, what now? Jonathan stepped back, looking at her one last time. Now? I moved forward. She held his gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly. I hope you find what you're looking for. Jonathan smirked, his voice calm. I already have. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Catherine standing there, alone, with nothing but the realization that she had lost something she would never get back. Jonathan walked through the city streets, the cool night air brushing against his skin as the sounds of passing cars and distant chatter filled the space around him. It had been a long night, one that had closed a chapter he had unknowingly been holding onto for too long. Seeing Catherine again, standing beside Nathan, watching the way she looked at him, not with love, not even with satisfaction, but with doubt, had been the final piece of the puzzle. She had thought she was trading up, thought she was making the practical, smart choice, but tonight, she had realized that money wasn't the only thing that made a man powerful. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the neon lights of the city reflecting off the damp pavement. Everything around him felt different now, as if he were finally seeing the world clearly for the first time in years. He wasn't the same man who had once measured his worth in deals closed and net worth figures. He wasn't the man who needed the approval of the social circles that had so easily discarded him. He had seen the truth. Money could buy loyalty, but it could never buy love. And now, he had something far more valuable than any fortune. He had clarity. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Margot. He hesitated for a moment before answering, a smirk already tugging at his lips. Checking in to see if I survived? Her voice was warm, laced with amusement. Something like that. I figured if you made it out of there without throwing a drink in someone's face, it was a win. Jonathan chuckled, his footsteps slowing as he leaned against a lamppost. You know me better than that. I don't waste good whiskey. Margot laughed softly on the other end, and for a moment, the weight of the night faded. There was something about her voice, about the way she spoke to him like he was still the same person no matter what the world thought, that made him feel like he wasn't completely alone in all of this. So, she continued, how did it feel? Jonathan exhaled, his gaze flickering toward the towering skyline. Like the closing of a book I should have put down a long time ago. Margot was silent for a moment, then sighed. Good. That means you're finally ready for whatever comes next. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, considering her words. And what do you think comes next? She let out a thoughtful hum. That depends. Do you want your old life back? Jonathan smirked, shaking his head. Not a chance. Good, she said simply. Then stop looking at this as a comeback and start seeing it as a beginning. Jonathan took a deep breath, the weight in his chest shifting into something lighter. She was right. This wasn't about reclaiming what was lost. It was about building something better. A sudden gust of wind blew through the streets, carrying the distant sound of laughter from a group of people exiting a nearby bar. The city was alive, moving forward, unconcerned with the past. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like he was moving with it. You're quiet, Margot said after a moment. Jonathan smirked. That's because I'm thinking. Margot chuckled. Dangerous habit. Only when I'm thinking about the wrong things, he admitted. She was quiet for a second, then spoke more softly. And are you? Jonathan exhaled, his grip on his phone tightening slightly. No, he said honestly. Not this time. There was something in the silence that followed. Something unspoken but understood between them. It had been there for a while, lingering in the spaces between conversations, in the way she had stood by him when no one else did. He hadn't wanted to acknowledge it before, hadn't been ready. But now, with everything stripped away, it was clearer than ever. Meet me tomorrow, he said suddenly, his voice steady. Margot hesitated. For what? Jonathan smiled to himself. To talk. She let out a soft breath, then murmured, All right, I'll see you tomorrow. Jonathan ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He turned his gaze back to the city, taking in the sight of a world that had once felt suffocating, but now felt full of possibility. He had lost everything and survived. Now, he was going to build something real, not for revenge, not for status, but because he finally understood what mattered. And this time, he wasn't going to do it alone. Catherine sat in the back of a sleek black car, staring out at the city lights as they passed in a blur. The streets that had once felt like hers, the high-rise buildings that had once represented a future filled with certainty, now seemed distant, untouchable. She had spent the last few months believing she had won, that she had made the right choice, that Jonathan's downfall had been inevitable, and that aligning herself with Nathan had been the only logical move. But tonight, after seeing Jonathan again, standing in that room with the same confidence, the same unshaken presence, she realized something she had been avoiding. She hadn't won it all. She shifted in her seat, crossing her arms as her jaw tightened. She had been so sure. When Jonathan had told her he was broke, when he had stood in front of her admitting that his fortune was gone, she had seen it as confirmation of what she had feared all along. That love was fragile, that security was what truly mattered. She had convinced herself that leaving had been necessary, that she had done what any rational woman would do in her position. And yet, as she watched Jonathan tonight, dressed in tailored confidence, with the world seemingly bending back to him, she realized how much she had miscalculated. "Everything all right?" Nathan's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned her head slightly, glancing at the man beside her. He was focused on his phone, barely paying attention to her, his thumb scrolling through emails as if the night they had just had was nothing more than another business engagement. Catherine studied him, really studied him, for the first time in a long time. He had the wealth, the status, the reputation, but something about him suddenly felt hollow. She thought back to the way Jonathan had looked at her earlier that evening, not with longing, not with regret, but with something far worse, indifference. He had walked into that lounge and faced her like she was just another person in the room, like she was part of his past, like she no longer had any hold over him. And that realization twisted deep in her stomach. She had expected him to crumble. She had expected him to feel the loss of her, to regret ever testing her, to want her back when he rebuilt. But instead, he had moved forward without her. She turned back to the window, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt empty even to her own ears. Nathan didn't look up. Good. The car pulled up in front of the Sterling estate, the grand mansion illuminated against the dark sky. Catherine stepped out without waiting for Nathan, her heels clicking against the stone driveway as she made her way up the stairs. She felt exhausted, but not from the evening itself. The weight pressing down on her was something else entirely, something unfamiliar. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay ahead, to make the right decisions, to align herself with the winning side. But what if, for the first time in her life, she had bet on the wrong future? Inside, the house was as grand as ever, with its towering ceilings and lavish decor. But as she stepped inside, it felt cold. She had once walked into this house and felt powerful. Now, she just felt misplaced. Nathan followed behind her, tossing his phone onto the marble counter. "So," he said casually, pouring himself a drink, "what did you think of Lancaster's big comeback?" Catherine turned to face him, crossing her arms. "You don't seem too concerned." Nathan smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Jonathan's a showman. He knows how to make an entrance. But that doesn't mean he's a threat." Catherine studied him. "Are you sure about that?" Nathan arched a brow. "You're giving him too much credit. He got lucky once. He lost everything. That kind of stain doesn't wash off easily." Catherine wasn't so sure. She had seen something in Jonathan tonight that Nathan clearly hadn't. A man who wasn't coming back to reclaim the past, but to build something even stronger. And that scared her in a way she couldn't fully explain. Nathan leaned back against the bar, smirking. "Besides, what does it matter? You chose me, remember?" Catherine exhaled, the words settling over her like a weight. "I chose you." She turned away, walking toward the large window overlooking the vast estate. The land stretched for acres, the manicured perfection of wealth on full display. It was everything she had thought she wanted, everything she had convinced herself she needed. But standing here now, after everything, it didn't feel like enough. Her gaze flickered back to Nathan. He was scrolling through his phone again, his mind already elsewhere, already moving on from this conversation like it was nothing more than a fleeting thought. He wasn't worried about Jonathan. He wasn't worried about her. And suddenly, she saw it all for what it was. She was nothing more than another possession in his world, another trophy in his collection, another asset that could be replaced at any time. She had left Jonathan because she had feared instability, but what she had failed to see was that real security didn't come from money. It came from knowing you truly mattered to someone. And Jonathan had mattered to her more than she had allowed herself to admit. Her chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. She had been wrong, and now it was too late to fix it. She swallowed hard, steadying herself. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Nathan looked up, sensing the shift in her silence. "Something on your mind?" Catherine forced a small smile, masking the storm inside her. "No," she lied. "Nothing at all." And with that, she turned, walking up the grand staircase to the life she had chosen, knowing deep down that she would never stop wondering about the life she had left behind.